really big word, and it's a really important word. And it's one of these words that, in detective shows, when they have a wall and they have pictures and they draw lines and strings, logos is one of these words that just has strings going. And what our little corner of the universe is doing, little corner of the internet is doing right now, is drawing even more strings to that word. So that word's, you're exactly right in pausing and saying, now, what do you mean by that word exactly? Because I had that thought, and you'll hear me have that thought, respond to it a little bit in the video that comes out Monday, when I sort of take the Vervaeke video and the Lawrence Krauss video and bounce some of those things off each other. So, yeah, it's a good question. Grim Grizz, your PVK, Vervaeke is VVK. I don't know why he would be. Vervaeke. Oh, okay, I guess so. The JVVK. The algorithm fed me the leftovers of you and the Apostles of Purpose in December, and aside from the urge to splice it with our talk for purpose of self-aggrandizement, you could do that, and promote paintball for Jesus, I noted I was struck by quite the wave of nostalgia. That's interesting. In part of it, Pageau maps Pentecost to Adam receiving the breath of life and how it brought the body of the church together. The power of symbolism is its reach. And as is often the case, its power and its weakness is the same, because you can put a lot of stuff together symbolically. And then you have, all of this stuff was the kind of stuff modernity tried to limit. How do we limit it? So one of the ways that modern scholarship tried to limit it was authorial intent, which is a really nice thing. And so when N.T. Wright attacks, and so that, about 10 years ago, there's a big spat between more conservative, reformed ministers and N.T. Wright over basically one of the themes that comes up in the Protestant Reformation, which Protestant reformers read in the Apostle Paul, which is the imparting of Christ's righteousness onto individual Christians. And that became a big part of the Protestant Reformation, and certain schools like the Reformed school. And N.T. Wright, in his looking at reading the Apostle Paul in light of a lot of the scholarship that has come about in first century Judaism, basically says, I don't think Paul intended that impartation of Christ's righteousness into the individual life of the believer. I think the reformational scholars who found that in Paul were bringing that into the text themselves. And N.T. Wright may very well be right. But you've got exactly the same dynamics with New Testament writers, the Apostle Paul's use of Hebrew scriptures. Because Paul is using allegory, especially in one or two cases. He is using typology, type and antitype. And not just Paul, all throughout the New Testament. And so Jewish scholars then step in and say, hey, wait a minute. Authorial intent, remember that? You evangelicals were using authorial intent to combat the modernists and to deal with fundamentalists, because part of the irony of fundamentalism is that they started, all kinds of other things started getting smuggled into the text, into the message that fundamentalists were deriving from the texts. And modernists and evangelical scholars were saying, hey, authorial intent, it's highly unlikely this particular author at this particular time could have intended that message, but here it is. And so symbolism doesn't worry about authorial intent, because your text is sort of living up here in the meaning register, in the meaning wavelength of being, let's say. And then you have to ask the question, well, is it true? And now we're back into modernist things. Is it true in terms of reference between a physical relationship? That's what modernity focuses on. And then modernity tries to kind of scale up, peek out a little bit. Is it true in terms of the mind of the author? If 2,000 years later, given the tiny corpus of writings we have from the Apostle Paul, given the very limited amount that we can actually know about the mind of first century Judaism, we're going to, in some ways, definitively decide what this particular human being was thinking in 54 AD in this particular city in the Roman Empire. My wife and I have been married for 33 years. We regularly don't know what each other is thinking. And I'm going to mind read this guy? Skeptics have a point. But yet mind read we sort of must. And it's reading the mind of God, which is what Christians are always trying to do and do together. And again, if you get really picky in terms of these little relationships, and the problem with modernity was not that it didn't bring out knowledge. It brought out plenty of knowledge. The problem is always with the application of that knowledge, because that application is always human. And when I talk to people about something like, let's say, the infallibility of Scripture, I'm much more comfortable with infallibility because it's much more 4P than inerrancy, which is very 1P. Infallibility is much more 4P. And when it comes to infallibility of Scripture, something I have to recognize is scriptural infallibility ends where my interpretation of that text begins, and I cannot engage with that text without interpreting it, which was basically the point that Peterson tried to make to Sam Harris in the first conversation in Vancouver. And Sam Harris, by virtue of his dogma, will simply reject that point. Because once Sam Harris really embraces that point, the rationalistic facade of monarchical vision modernity collapses. Because you are not an objective viewer, and you cannot and will not have a perfect monarchical vision. As a Christian, I say, only God can see that clearly, but God sees everything that clearly. Back to the question. The rest of it, in part, Pageau maps Pentecost to Adam receiving the breath of life and how it brought body to the body of church together. The rest of it was two of you discussing the inanimate left hand I'm speaking of, and it struck me that the tingling in those fingers at that time seems to have had the life sucked out of it by the splash of the whale that swallowed Jordan Peterson, being confused for his second coming wave. Do you see why I see what I see? You see a lot. And it's the more you see, the harder it is to put together a usable, coherent framework. That's what we're all doing. And sometimes you got to go with the framework you got. Would you reflect on what was brewing in this corner of the internet before Peterson's return and how things played out? Wave 2, if depending on Peterson's health, might be a very short wave. We'll see. In some ways, okay, I'm going to say something that I don't want anybody to misunderstand because it isn't ill meant. There are many times after June 2019 that Jordan Peterson could have died. Many times. And that's, Peterson has revealed that. Mikhail has revealed that. It's really rather amazing. Peterson is alive today and able to function as well as he did. even between now and January. Remember, wave 2 is really only got started in October, November, January. He sort of started releasing videos again, and he's going to take a step back now because of health. There'll probably be more of these step backs. You know, we have no idea. So, but if Jordan Peterson had not survived COVID or benzo withdrawal, which sounded like a very real thing, we would, part of what was happening in this little corner of the internet before wave 2 was sort of waiting for Godot, because is Jordan Peterson going to come back? Is he going to do another biblical series? Is wave 2 going to be like wave 1, only bigger? Will Jordan Peterson once again get into it with the press and talk to Kathy Newman and have those takedown interviews? And well, we kind of got, you know, we got a little taste of that with the Times of London thing, that Peterson's like, I don't have the energy to fight that fight right now. And so I'm going to have conversations with people I want to and post them on my own channel, and do conversations with other people who, I don't know why he picks I don't know what criteria he uses to appear on the other channels that he does. You know, David Fuller mentions, and quite interestingly enough, Jordan has not been back on Rebel Wisdom. And I think David would love to have him back on Rebel Wisdom. Does Jordan, you know, and then now we're trying to mind read Jordan Peterson. But in terms of the time between June, I got to keep my ears, June 2019 and January 2021, that was really the trough between the waves. This little corner of the internet was sort of waiting for Godot, because Peterson was alive and we expected he would return, but we had no idea what that would mean. Sort of like waiting for the second coming. You're right. If Peterson had died, then he would have been more of a martyr and saint, at least for some, and villain for others. So now that he's back, and he did a conversation with Pageau, and he did a conversation with Vervaeke, and Vervaeke mentioned that there at least was, to my knowledge, it hasn't happened. We'll have to see about Peterson's health. Another conversation with Pageau and Vervaeke together, that's going to be interesting. Yeah, maybe Hank is going to imagine I'm going to do 20 commentaries on that video. Analyze every word. We'll pause the video and analyze all the use of the word logos, and Peterson's nuance, and Vervaeke's nuance, and Pageau's nuance. Now, I know some of you get a little frustrated with my first commentary on Vervaeke Peterson was 2+ hours, and I barely touched the video. Well, why would you do that, VanderKlay? Well, that's kind of a scholarship thing to do, and this is what you do with biblical scholarship. Before I dive into a text in 1 Corinthians, I go back over the scholarship about, what is that book, 1 Corinthians? What's behind that book? Because if you want to understand what's in the book, you need to know something about the book. And what surfaced very clearly in the Vervaeke Peterson video was, there was stuff going on behind the scenes there. Was Peterson healthy? Is he being mischievous? Is he dealing with John because he knows John? Well, what are the layers beneath John's relationship with Peterson? You know, something that probably neither of them will talk about too candidly publicly, because they shouldn't, because this is personal stuff. So, yeah. And I think what was going on in our little corner of the internet is that we were continuing to develop our relationships with one another in anticipation of Peterson coming back, also not knowing what Peterson's second coming would mean. Now we know a little bit more, but again, because of what was put out on Twitter and what Michaela said at the beginning of I can't read the video chat here. What God, That's what happens when I let other words into my sight. What was happening in the second coming? Well, now we know more. But now, because of what Michaela said on the audio version of the podcast, and because of what Peterson's account said on Twitter, we don't know. The second wave might sort of come to an end. There might be another period of silence. Maybe the akathisia will finally be conquered. Maybe the akathisia is something that he has to deal with for the rest of his life. Heaven forbid. We don't know. And that's the way history is. But what's been amazing is that we've been able to sustain, even just between, we're talking about plans to do that conference in Thunder Bay at some point with Vervaeke and Pageau and myself. It's been amazing that we've been able to maintain good relations between the three of us. Why? Are any of the three of us hard to get along with? No, I think we're all quite easy to get along with. But by virtue of our position in established communities, let's say my church, someone somewhere in the Christian Reformed Church decides that it's not appropriate for me to ask a question on a video like, did John Vervaeke turn Paul VanderKlay into a non-theist? I mean, I'm in a position that if someone really wanted to come after me within the Christian Reformed Church, they could take a shot at it. Now, I think it would be a little difficult because they'd have to, the way the polity of the Christian Reformed Church works, you'd have to get me through my church council. And then the next layer, you'd have to get me through my regional classis. And then you'd maybe try and make a play for me at Synod. Nobody's tried that. If you really want to come after me, I have about 10,000 hours of video you have to go through. Good luck. It's not worth it. Are there some people in the Christian Reformed Church that aren't particularly happy about how I've spent the last 3 years on YouTube? There very much are. Is it worth it for them to try and take me down? Well, the thing is, if they would get me kicked out of ministry in the Christian Reformed Church, that doesn't shut up my YouTube channel. So, it's sort of like, what's the point? So, but, Vervaeke and Pageau and I continue to talk together, and that's kind of amazing. And the fact that Jordan Peterson, it looks like, is in some ways going to enter into the conversation in this little corner of the internet in a bigger way, perhaps. Well, that has a lot of implications. I mean, John Vervaeke's channel is about 30,000. I haven't taken a look at what bump it got from his conversation with Peterson. It's a lot smaller than you might imagine. It almost always is. Pageau's up around 120,000. Maybe we'll hit 20,000 later this year if current growth patterns kind of hold their own. So, there's a reason that Vervaeke and Pageau are going to talk with Peterson and I'm not, because having a conversation with 4 would be a lot more than having with 3. He's got established relationships with both Vervaeke and Pageau. He knows who I am, but, there'd be absolutely no reason Jordan Peterson would watch hours of Paul VanderKlay video. Might benefit him if you'd ask me, but he's not going to do it because for a whole bunches of other reasons. So, but then the conference in Thunder Bay is going to be a really big deal because that'll be the first time that Vervaeke and Pageau and I actually meet each other in person, and our conversations are going to be more extensive, and we are going to be playing on stage in different ways there. I will be preaching for a service. That was at least the original plan, because this urban abbey is a church of sorts. And so in that sense, I'm bringing in a different element of my person, which is my ecclesiastical voice, which is on the channel to a degree, but it's not forefronted. This is a personal channel. And what I do, I'm doing it from my office, but I bought all this equipment, and this is a personal enterprise. So, but the church also supports it and sees it as being of kingdom benefit. So there's a lot that's here. It's a lot that's here. Sally Joe, riffing off Grim Grizz, says, paintball for Jesus. Interdenominational league is the most valid church promotional thing in 100 years. Also similar to PewDiePie's meme review, we need church review. Oh, boy. I don't know. John James, we're running out of time. Dear Mr. VanderKlay, if it's all right,